Hi there guys, and so welcome to the second video in the Unraid 6.9.x playlist. And in this video we're going to be looking at two things. The first thing is doing a fresh install of Unraid 6.9 totally from scratch. And secondly, we're going to look at upgrading an existing Unraid system that's running 6.8.3 and look at the preparation steps that we have to do beforehand to get us onto 6.9. Sounds interesting? Then let's get started. Okay, so in this second part of the series on Unraid 6.9.x, we're going to start with installing Unraid 6.9 onto a brand new server. We'll create the USB flash drive, take a look at some BIOS settings in the motherboard, then boot up the server, install some plugins, community applications, unassigned devices and the Preclear plugin, after which we'll set up an array and one pool, the cache pool, with multiple pools being covered in part 5 of this series. And now for you existing Unraid users who are already running a server and just want to see the best practices to upgrade to the latest version of Unraid, well, you can skip past the first half onto the second half where we'll be looking at upgrading. But for now, let's make a start and install a fresh version of Unraid 6.9. So let's head on across to a Windows PC and create the USB stick. So the first thing to do is let's plug in our USB stick into the computer and then open a browser and go to unraid.net. Once here we want to click onto the download button here, and here we can download a USB creator tool. There's one for Mac and one for Windows. I'm on Windows, so I'm going to click on download for Windows. Okay, so once it's downloaded I'm just going to drop that onto the desktop and close the browser window. Now let's run this file, and under version we want to leave it on stable. On this drop down list we can see the stable versions of Unraid. At the moment it's 6.9.1, so choose the newest stable version that's available here when you run this tool. So now the next thing to do is click on to customize here, and you can name your server here. I'm going to call mine Galactica. You also get the option here to be able to set a static IP address. However, I'm going to leave mine to be assigned by the router using DHCP. This little tick box here which says allow UEFI boot. If your motherboard supports that and you want to boot by UEFI, then tick that box. I personally prefer to boot legacy, but you can choose what you want to do here. So all you need to do now is just click onto write. Now one thing to note is when you do this, anything on that USB stick will be erased. So if you're sure there's nothing on there, just click erase and write. Now I've got a video that goes into far more detail about how to actually set up Unraid using the flash creator, and you can see that video here. Okay, so the first stage is finished now. It's downloaded the OS, and so now it's going to actually extract it and write it to the flash drive. Okay, so that's all done. So now we can close this tool and make sure to eject the drive. And after ejecting the USB flash we can remove it from the computer and pop it into the server. But before we boot up into our new server, let's just check the BIOS settings on our motherboard. So before we can actually boot up the system, we have to change the boot order so the USB flash drive is the first thing which the computer tries to boot from. Now all motherboards are slightly different, but what you need to do is you need to look for the section where the boot order is. On mine it's under the section here called boot, and what you need to do here in the boot order, because Unraid boots from the flash drive, the primary boot device must be your flash drive. And you can see here that mine is set to the USB flash drive, my Samsung drive here. But you may be wondering why the Samsung drive is listed twice. No, it's not actually two separate flash drives, it is only one. But the first one which I boot from is the legacy boot. If you had chosen that you wanted to boot from UEFI in the flash creation tool and tick that box, then you'd want to have the UEFI boot option to be first. So the flash drive's listed twice here because that's two different ways the computer can boot from that USB drive. Now one thing to note if you're booting from legacy is most motherboards nowadays are UEFI, and to boot from legacy you have to have something called the CSM or the compatibility support module to be enabled. Now normally by default you find that it normally is enabled, but if for any reason it isn't and you want to boot legacy, then find the compatibility module support on your motherboard and change it to be enabled. So some of you out there may be thinking, hey SpaceInvader, why do you boot your server as legacy boot and not UEFI? Isn't UEFI newer? Well, yep, it is newer, but I've found many times, not only with my own servers but when I've been helping others as well, that some problems that people experience with GPU pass-through can be eliminated when booting legacy. With that said, it doesn't mean that if you do boot from UEFI you'll have any problems at all. A lot of people don't. With that said though, it doesn't mean that you will have problems passing through a GPU if you boot with UEFI, because many people don't. And in fact I've actually heard from some people that can't actually pass through their GPU unless they do boot in UEFI. But from what I've seen over the years, most hardware seems to work better booting the server from legacy. So my advice is, try legacy first. You can always switch the server to boot to UEFI if you find you have to because something's not working. And for those people who do boot from UEFI and do have problems with GPU pass-through, these problems can be fixed as well. But it's just more easy, if it works, to boot from legacy and not have the problems in the first place. Now, to avoid getting loads of comments below, I know that some graphics cards such as the RX 5700, they don't boot well in OSs such as Windows on non-UEFI motherboards. Now this makes absolutely no difference to us when we're passing through the GPU to a VM. And that's because when we pass through a GPU to a VM, that card is passed through to a virtual motherboard, which by default whose BIOS is what's called OVMF, which basically is UEFI. The BIOS type C BIOS is legacy. So yes, the RX 5700 wouldn't work if we use C BIOS, but it does with OVMF because it's UEFI. And that makes no difference to how you booted your server when it first starts. Okay, so that's enough about the boot order. Now let's go on and think about other settings in the motherboard that we might need to change. If you want to run VMs on your server, then you need to have the CPU virtualization settings enabled, and if you want to pass through devices to that VM, you also need to have Iommu enabled too. So let's go and have a look at these settings over on an Intel motherboard. So here I'm going to go across to the advanced settings, and here under CPU configuration I'm going to check if the Intel virtualization is enabled. Okay, so the CPU virtualization settings, the Intel VTD, is currently disabled, so I'm going to enable that so I can use VMs. So on Intel motherboards the CPU virtualization is called VTD, but now let's have a look at the same on an AMD motherboard. On AMD motherboards the same feature is called SMV. So if you've got an AMD, make sure that SMV mode is set to enabled. So back over on the Intel board, now we need to actually enable pass-through to be able to work by enabling Iommu. And Intel call Iommu, they call it VTD. And I'm going to go under chipset here and enable the VTD. Okay, again let's go over to an AMD motherboard now and look at the same. Okay, so on AMD boards Iommu is called, well, Iommu. But there's one really important thing to make sure of on AMD motherboards is that Iommu is set to enabled and not, and I repeat, not set to auto. Auto doesn't enable Iommu fully and correctly, so it must be set to enabled. Okay, so back over on the Intel board again, if your system has built-in graphics, then make sure to set that to be the primary graphics adapter. You can see here I'm setting mine to be primary as on board. When we do this, when Unraid boots up, its display, its terminal console window will come through this graphics card. This is advantageous because it makes any other graphics card that we plug in, you know, like a GTX 1080 Ti or something, that then becomes a secondary card because our onboard graphics is primary. So this can make passing through a GPU a little bit easier. But don't worry if you don't have onboard graphics, I don't either on my server. We can pass through any graphics card at all, but passing through a graphics card that is the primary graphics card just takes a little bit more work. And we'll look at that in a later video when we're setting up our first VM. Okay, so other BIOS settings to be aware of. Make sure that any SATA controllers are set to AHCI, make sure they're not set to RAID. If you've got SATA hot plug you can set that to enabled, but it's not essential. And just one last thing to look at, only for AMD Ryzen and Threadripper users. If you find after leaving your server inactive for a while it freezes up, then you may need to disable the global C states. Just set that to disabled and then reboot the server. Okay, so that's everything with the BIOS, so once your BIOS settings are all good, reboot the server and then boot up into Unraid 6.9 for the first time. The first thing you'll see when the server boots is this blue boot menu here. The default boot mode is the Unraid OS in normal mode, which will boot up and then you access the Unraid server through another computer using a web browser. Now if you don't have access to another computer, you can boot Unraid in what's called GUI mode. In GUI mode, when Unraid boots up, it will boot straight into a web browser and straight into the Unraid web UI. The other options here are really just for troubleshooting. At the very bottom you can see memtest86. This is a program that tests the RAM in your server. Now it takes a long time to run, many hours, but it's very thorough and it can help you detect if you've got a faulty RAM stick. The other modes here are safe modes for Unraid, which will boot the server in either normal mode or GUI mode, but without any plugins running at all. Again, this is used for troubleshooting in case you've installed a plugin which prevents the server from booting. Okay, so the most common way to boot Unraid is just the normal mode, and it will automatically boot this way after a few seconds if you don't touch anything and choose otherwise. And this is the case whether you have a monitor connected or not. So once the server's booted up, to be able to access its web UI, we need to know the IP address of the server. Now if we've got a monitor connected, well, that's really easy. As the server boots, you'll see various texts. And when the server's completely booted, at the bottom you'll see its IP address. And this server here, its IP address is 10.10.20.175. At the bottom here you can see it says Galactica Login. Now that's the name of the server, and mine's called Galactica because I named it that earlier when I made the USB flash drive. If you didn't name your server anything, the default name for the server would be Tower. Now if you don't have a monitor connected to your server, you can still find out what the IP address is. But really, if you don't have a monitor connected to the server, it would have been best if you set a fixed IP address in the USB flash creator. But if you didn't, you can find out from your router. For my router, I'm using pfSense. Now all routers are different, but you will find a place where it says DHCP leases somewhere in your router settings. You just need to find that section and go there, and it will list all of the IP addresses it's given out to things on your network. So all you need to do is find the name of your server in that list and you'll find its IP address. And again, because I've given mine a custom name, it's not called Tower, mine's called Galactica, and here's my IP 10.10.20.175. So that's how you find the IP address if you didn't set one and you don't have a monitor plugged in. But it's much easier if you have a monitor plugged in just to see the IP address or set an IP which you know it's going to use. Okay, so once we've got the IP address of the server, all we need to do is pop it into a browser and then we can access straight into the Unraid GUI. Then the first thing I'm going to come to is this registration page here, and we can either purchase a key or we can get a trial key. I'm going to click on Get Trial Key and then Start Trial, and we can see here my trial started, and so if I find I like Unraid then I can register later. Okay, so this is the first screen you're going to come to after you've either registered or you've got your trial license. Now before we do anything here, I'm going to install a couple of really essential plugins that really help us get our Unraid server up and running. So I'm going to click onto the Plugins tab here, and I'm going to click onto here where it says Install Plugin. Now if we go across to the Unraid website and we go to the forums, and we look under Application Support then Plugin Support, if we scroll down, you're going to find a post that's called Community Applications. And so on this post, let's click onto it, and if we scroll down to where it says Installation, you'll see this URL here. So what we want to do is copy this here, copy it onto your clipboard, go back to the Unraid server and paste it in here. Now I've also put this linked in the description if you don't want to go onto the Unraid forums and find this, but wherever you get it from, paste it into here and then click onto install. So with that done, click onto done here, and once that's installed, if we refresh the page, we can see there's another tab here called apps. So let's click onto that now. And we have to say we understand this warning here, so click onto I understand, and the same again. Okay, so it says the Docker service is not enabled. That's absolutely fine at the moment. We don't need the Docker service right now. Now the first plugin I'm going to install is something called Unassigned Devices. Now this is probably one of the most essential plugins that you can have. And you can see if we search for that, there's the Unassigned Devices here and the Unassigned Devices Plus. I'd recommend installing both of these. So that's that one installed, and now the next one. We just click on this little arrow to install anything from Community Applications. And the other plugin I recommend installing when you're first setting up the server is Preclear Disks. So do a search for Preclear and install this one here. Again, click on the little down arrow to install. Okay, and that's done. Right, so now we can go back to the main tab. Okay, so this is where we install all of the disks into Unraid, and we set up our array and various other pool. But before we do that, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, and under Unassigned Devices here I can see all of the disks that are in this server. Now a moment ago we installed a plugin called the Preclear Disks plugin. So I'm going to click onto Plugins at the top here, and I'm going to click on the icon for Preclear Disks, and again I can see all of the disks that are in the server. Now if you've got any new disks that you've just bought, you can stress test the disks before using them in the server. Now this is a useful thing to do because you don't want to buy a new disk that may be faulty a couple of weeks down the road and you find it fails. It's best to test it first before putting it into the server so you can avoid that happening. Now if your disks are old and they've been in other servers before or other computers, I probably wouldn't bother doing that myself, but any new drives I ever buy I always pre-clear them, with the exception of any SSDs or NVMe drives. You shouldn't pre-clear any of them, only mechanical drives. But remember, pre-clearing drives does take a long time, and for me to pre-clear these 4 8TB drives, well, it's probably going to take me at least a day. So if you want to stress test the disks, then click on to Start Pre-Clear. Now to make it a little quicker, you can click this one here to skip the pre-read. Because what happens when you pre-clear a disk and stress test it is it reads every sector on the disk, then it writes a 0 to every sector on the disk, and then it rereads every sector afterwards to check that's been done correctly. So personally, I always skip the pre-read and just have it write the zeros and then do the post-read. But you can choose what you want to do here and then just click on Start. And once you've done that, you can see that the process has started. Because I skipped the pre-read, it's just gone straight to zeroing, and it's zeroing all of these disks here. So you just wait for this process to finish and then the drives will be ready to be added to the array. Now to go into more detail about this plugin, this pre-clear plugin, I made a video a few years ago about pre-clearing disks, which I'm going to link up here. Well, I've actually already pre-cleared these drives before, so I'm just going to cancel this now for me and then go back to the main tab in order to assign my disks. Okay, so this first part here is where we set up our array. Now we need to have at least one data disk. So under disk 1, I'm going to choose this 8TB drive here, and also a second 8TB drive. Now if I was to leave the array like this, I would have 16TB of space, but should one of these drives fail, I wouldn't be able to recreate the data. So to be able to recreate the data and have some protection with this array, we need to add a parity disk. So we can add up to 2 parity disks, which will protect the array. I'm going to add one here. Now there's one thing, is your parity disk has to be the same size or larger than the largest disk you've got in the array. So because my data disk's 8TB, I need to have a parity drive that is 8TB or larger. Now there's one thing you shouldn't put in the main array, that is you shouldn't add any NVMe drives or any SSD drives. These shouldn't go in the main array. If you want to use SSDs, then we need to set up separate pools and use them there. Using an SSD in the main array can actually break parity, so should one of your drives fail, when you try and recreate the data, it won't be correct. So make sure only to put mechanical hard drives in your main array. And now let's scroll down. Now here I'm going to click on Add Pool. And I'm going to make my first pool for the regular cache drive. And as this is the first pool I'm creating, Unraid automatically calls it cache. Now here under slots I can choose how many drives are going to make up this cache pool. Because I only want one drive in this pool, I'm going to just select one slot. But if you wanted more drives in the pool, you select more slots. So to create the pool, we just click onto the Add button here. And now when we scroll down, we can see the pools being created, but no drives being assigned. So for my cache drive, I'm going to use only one drive, and I'm going to use this regular SSD here. Okay, so now that's assigned. I'm not going to add any more pools at the moment. We'll come back and do that in one of the following videos. So what we want to do now is we want to scroll down to the bottom and click on to Start. Now it warns us that the parity disk content will be overwritten. That's absolutely fine. Let's click on to Proceed. And now you'll notice that it says that all of these partitions are unmountable. That's because the drives haven't been formatted. So let's scroll down to the bottom and we can see the unmountable disks here. And if we click here, agree here to the warning, and then press Format, that will format all of those drives. So let's do that now. And you can see now it says it's formatting the disks, and once these drives are formatted, the server will be ready to use. Okay, so the drives are formatted now and the array is created. I've got a 3-disk array giving me 16TB, and I've got one cache pool here with my 1TB SSD, and I've still got these 3 other drives here which are currently unassigned. And you can see here now it says the server's doing a parity sync. This will take a number of hours to complete. This is done when the server's first set up in order to protect the array in case one of these data drives fails, allowing us to rebuild it. Now you can continue to use the server whilst this parity check's going on, or you can wait till it's finished. And that's the reason why we see this warning triangle here, because it's telling us the parity is invalid because it hasn't finished doing the parity check. Okay, so once your parity sync's finished, you're going to get nice little green dots here saying that everything's fine. Okay, so there's a few things we need to do now just to secure up our server, and these steps are important. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to users here, and under the root user, which is basically like the admin account, it's very important to set a password. So pop in a password here, make sure it's quite strong, and retype it again, and then click on to change. Okay, and so now when we access the server, we're always going to come into a login screen, which will keep our server much more secure. Now yeah, it does take a couple more seconds to type in your username and password, but that's a small price to pay to make sure your server doesn't get compromised. Okay, and Bitwarden's asking if it should remember. I'm going to say yes, so I don't even have to type the password in anymore. Okay, so the next thing here, we can see here there's another orange triangle here. So what this means is the flash drive is able to be viewed on the network as a network share. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click onto flash here, and under SMB security settings I'm going to change this export here from yes to no, and then click on to apply. So now the flash drive isn't accessible over the network. If I wanted to access the flash drive, I can just come back here if I want to and change this to yes, access it, and then put it back. Okay, so that's the server all set up and working on Unraid 6.9. Now the future videos in this series will come back and set up extra things. Those will be the videos that really show the extra functionality of 6.9. But now it's time to upgrade an existing server which is running Unraid 6.8.3. And the reason I'm making the videos in this order and combining the install and the upgrade video into one is really for two reasons. Firstly, it means that all subsequent videos in this series, everyone's going to be running 6.9. New users will have installed a new system and existing users will all be upgraded. And the other reason is, people who have watched the first part of this video who are new users, they'll also know how to upgrade their system if they see an upgrade come out. Okay, so here we are on an Unraid server running 6.8.3. So as with upgrading to any version of Unraid, the first thing we should do is we should go to the plugins tab and upgrade all of our plugins. And once we're on the plugins tab, we want to click check for updates so we can see if there's any updates available. And as you can see here on my server, there's a whole bunch of updates. So to update them, click on update all plugins, then click done. Now when upgrading from 6.8.3, you may have a plugin installed which we need to remove. And that plugin is the VFIO PCI config plugin. And what this plugin does is to allow us to isolate or stub various pieces of hardware which we want to better pass through to a VM. Now don't worry, you're not going to lose this great functionality, because this is now built directly into Unraid 6.9. Just so it won't cause any conflicts, we want to remove the plugin before we do the upgrade. Okay, so now with that done, we need to just make sure that nothing's running now, there's no services running. So let's go to the main tab and then scroll down, because we just want to double check that Mover isn't running. It's not running here, so that's good. And also while we're here, let's go to Docker, stop all of the containers, because after we upgrade everything's going to reboot anyway. And also because the server's going to reboot after the update, we need to check that there's no VMs running either. And I've got a Pop! OS one running here, so I'm going to shut mine down. So that's all the preparation we need to do, so let's head across to Tools and click onto the button here to update the OS. So we want to be on Stable Branch here and then click Check for Updates. And now we can see at the moment the latest version is 6.9.1. So I'm going to click onto Update. Then just sit back and relax while it pulls down the latest version of Unraid. This is sped up quite a lot, so it will take a few minutes. Okay, so once that's done, we're ready to reboot, so let's click onto Done. Let's go across to the main tab here. Now at the top here we just click on Reboot Now. And once the server's rebooted, we're in the new version of Unraid. Now it might sound a bit pointless, but I always think it's a good idea once you've upgraded as well to come back to the plugins tab once again and just double check there aren't any more updates. Okay, so there's no more updates here for me, that's good. And as well, because we just upgraded, why not bring all the Docker containers up to date? So go over to your Docker tab and just double check there are no updates for your containers. Okay, there are none here for me, so once you've done all of that, you're all ready to use Unraid 6.9. So guys, that brings us to the end of the second part in this series. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, I'd really appreciate you giving it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel for more content. And to all of my patrons and supporters out there, hey guys, thank you so much for supporting me. I really do appreciate it. Without you guys, I really wouldn't be able to make these videos. Well, it's time to wrap up now and time to go, but whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you in the next video.